and I think we'll start with Mercedes because they're capturing a lot of the headlines for what was a frustrating weekend overall, lackluster. Where on earth did the pace go after what was a really strong performance a year ago at this circuit?
That's what Mercedes were asking themselves on Sunday night. And I think part of the reason why it was so shocking was because they went into this race talking about, here's one of our last chances to have a go at victory. I was one of the people that believed that. I put Lewis Hamilton as my top tip to win the race. It was a bit of a punt because we all know that Verstappen has the fastest car usually at any weekend, but I thought this could be the opportunity, a track that suited them last year. They just got the car sorted after an upgrade in the US Grand Prix. Things went well in Mexico, got the second place sealed. The one at the US Grand Prix, of course, was disqualified. And then I just thought, everything is trending towards potential victory in Brazil. And the pace just wasn't there. And there's a number of reasons, I think. They're still trying to figure it out themselves. They seem to say that they don't know exactly where the pace went. But again, it was a sprint weekend. So you get that one practice session on a Friday to set up the car and get everything right. And they think, whereas in the US, they ran the car too low and they ended up falling foul of the plank rules, where you have to have a certain amount of wear on the plank, and they exceeded that. And yeah, in this one, perhaps they went a little bit too conservative. So they ran the car a little bit too high. And then they were struggling with grip. They had this huge rear wing, so much more downforce than that they'd usually put on there, and it just wasn't delivering the performance that they wanted. So it seemed like the floor and the wing wasn't working together. And then they tried to fix that in the race by changing the front wing level to kind of balance everything out and try and protect the tires. And then that just led to this car that was just awful, understeering through corners. So as the driver turned in, the car more or less just went straight rather than turning into the corner. And so they had this handling issue throughout the race. And that's fundamentally where they lost their time. Now, clearly it was a track that didn't suit them, and that they'll want to figure out why that was. But there are a few setup issues which seem to be the problem. And had it been a normal weekend with 3 practice sessions, maybe they would have figured those out in FP2 and 3, but they just didn't get the chance. So that appears to be what went wrong.
So Lewis finishes P8 and George unfortunately retired after around lap 57. Are you surprised that Mercedes, a team and an organization to their pedigree, I guess is a fair way to put it, has struggled so much with their concept, their setup, and ultimately putting together a car that is what they said, a miserable thing to drive? The car doesn't deserve to win. I mean, the frustration that boiled over from Toto Wolff and Lewis Hamilton seemed warranted, quite frankly.
Yeah, so we've seen that a number of points this year where the car's really been bad. And the first one was in Bahrain at the very first race, where Toto Wolff basically wrote off the season and the concept. And let's be honest, he was right. That car hasn't won a race. You got to remember, Mercedes have won at least one race every year since 2012. So assuming they don't win either of the next 2 races, and the odds are probably against them, given the circuits we're going to, they face, this end of a run. And we obviously saw things slip last year in 2022. They got the fundamental concept of the car wrong under these new regulations, and they've struggled ever since. But, with a team like Mercedes, the expectation, having won 8 Constructors' Championships prior to that, is that you then get it right. You figure out what's gone wrong, you get it right. And they didn't. And they made similar mistakes, or they stuck to their guns on certain things. And they basically just underestimated as well what Red Bull were going to do over the winter, and the step that Red Bull were able to find with their concept. So this is basically the car as it looks now. I mean, there's a number of things which have come to recent races which will be taken forward, but a lot of it will just be thrown in the bin, and they're starting again with a new concept. Like I said, they've started to explore a few ideas within that, and that's where some of the positive performances have come from. So everything after Monaco was a little bit better this year because they brought a big upgrade there, and then there was another upgrade again, like I said, in the US, which worked at the US and Mexico but didn't work in Brazil. So there's been little signs of it getting better, but there's just some fundamental things baked into this car, basically the chassis design, the layout of it with the suspension, things like that, which they cannot change. They haven't been able to change this year, and they've desperately been wanting to. So the real test of it all comes next year. But I don't know. I mean, I think I'm being fairly kind to them. There's a few journalists I've heard who have been pretty brutal about what they've done this year and the lack of results, and also a few people questioning Toto Wolff and whether he's committed to Mercedes and wants to remain there long term and set everything right. Everything I've heard is that he does, but the fact that those questions are being asked, that they haven't scored results to the point that those questions can be asked, it's really not where that team should be.
When you look ahead to the future, and you mentioned a few positives to be able to draw on and move forward with, is there any hope that Mercedes can compete and contend with Red Bull in 2024 or 2025?
Well, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record because I think I said this at the end of last year as well, but we should get a fairly clear picture within the first few races of next year. Last year, they said exactly the same thing. We've understood what we've done wrong. We're going to make the fundamental changes we need to make to our concept to then set it off. Now, I think the changes that they're going to make into next year are going to be even bigger. But with that comes a huge risk. I remember James Allison talking, I think it was in Baku this year. James Allison is the technical director at Mercedes now, and he was the chief technical officer back then, but we won't go into changing roles and all that kind of stuff. And he said, when you're going with a concept of a car, it's like you're climbing a mountain. But then that's all well and good, and you get to the peak and you see where you ultimately have got to and what the potential is. But if you decide halfway through, actually, we've got the wrong concept, and you look over over the horizon, you see a taller mountain and you want to start climbing that, well, that's all well and good. Your eventual point may be higher up, but you've got to go all the way down and start climbing all the way back up again. So this is the risk that Mercedes has by completely changing what they're going to do with the car going forward, is that they're going to come down off the concept they had, and they're going to have to start more or less, from the bottom with another one. Now, I think they've, as I said, started to explore some ideas. Of course, the work on next year's car would have been going on for a very long time. And there are some sounds, some noises of optimism coming from Mercedes. But the problem is that Red Bull aren't standing still. So if we use the mountain analogy again, if Red Bull are halfway up their mountain, well, they're going to keep climbing over the winter, and Mercedes has got to climb twice as fast to catch up.
I'd like to think that you could gain confidence from Aston Martin and the turnaround that we saw from the end of last season to what we saw at the beginning of this season. I mean, it was remarkable and it was drastic. Now, they didn't obviously remain consistent with it throughout the entirety of this season. Or you could point to McLaren, who struggled obviously from the start, and it looked like they were going to really have difficulty finding wins, finding pace this season. And then they had an unbelievable turnaround. So it is possible, but comparing those two teams to the likes of Mercedes, I think just shows exactly where this team is and why maybe some journalists are not being too kind to them at the moment, because there are such high expectations, especially when you have two phenomenal drivers in Lewis Hamilton and George Russell.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.